Our speaker this evening is probably someone who actually is actually true, doesn't need introduction in this audience, but I will do so anyway. And I thought I would check in advance, of course, saying a few words about John Curtis, who will be giving this evening's lecture, by checking some dates via the internet. And so I quickly looked up John Curtis, and what I discovered was that John Curtis is an English former professional footballer, a versatile defender who could play anywhere alongside the back four as a defensive midfielder. And I'm sure that's absolutely true. But we have other reasons, of course, to welcome John this evening. John, of course, you will know, is a very distinguished archaeologist and museum curator. He is, of course, in this context, in our context this evening, the president of the British Institute for the Study of Iraq. He was keeper of the Middle East Department of the British Museum between 1989 and 2011, and then chief executive officer of the Iran Heritage Foundation until October 2020. He's a trustee of the Honor Frost Foundation. He's written over 20 books and more than 100 articles. And of course, as an archaeologist, he's directed excavations at numerous sites, 8 in Iraq itself, on behalf of the British Museum between 1982 and 1989, including the important Assyrian sites of Khirbet Kadri, Khirbet Katunya, Nimrud, of course, and Balawat. He's also curated a number of really significant exhibitions, including Art and Empire, Treasures from Assyria in the British Museum. That was actually shown in 9 different venues worldwide. Forgotten Empire, the World of Ancient Persia, 2005 to 6. The Cyrus Cylinder at the National Museum, Tehran, 2010 to 11. And then the Cyrus Cylinder and Ancient Persia that was shown at 5 different US museums in 2013. He was, again, you will know, the first Western archaeologist to enter the Iraq Museum after the looting of the museum in 2003. And has since that time played a really active and important role in attempts to protect the cultural heritage of Iraq, not least, of course, in the establishment and BC's ongoing support for the Basra Museum. It's absolutely fundamental strand of BC's work. He was elected a fellow of the British Academy in 2003 and awarded an OBE for services to museums in 2006. But it is this evening, which is the Malouan lecture, that he will talk to us. And it's very appropriate that an excavator at Nimrud is giving us a talk named in honor of one of the other great excavators of Nimrud. And he will talk to us this evening about another Assyriological excavator, William Kennett Loftus, a 19th century archaeologist in Mesopotamia. And John's book brings together the transcriptions and introduction to William Loftus's work in Iraq will be available after his talk. But please, for the moment, join me in welcoming Dr. John Curtis to give this evening's lecture.
Well, thank you very much, Paul, for that generous, very generous introduction. It's a great honor to be giving the Malouan lecture this evening, but I thought what I would do was to look up and see what Malouan himself actually said about Loftus. In fact, he waxes lyrical about Layard, who was to some extent Malouan's role model, but he says relatively little about Loftus, even though he published some of the ivories that Loftus discovered at Nimrud. For reasons I think that will become clear, Loftus hasn't really been the credit he deserved. He hasn't been accorded the credit he deserves for his pioneering archaeological work. For example, Mogens Trolle Larsen, in his book, The Conquest of Assyria, says of Loftus that he was a deeply traditional man without much imagination who had an extremely violent temper. Well, one of the reasons for this lack of appreciation is, I think, the shortage of sources. It's true that Loftus wrote a book about his early excavations, and he wrote a few articles, and there's a quite excellent study of his life by Stephen Harbottle in a Newcastle journal called Archaeologia Aeliana. There are a few letters from him in places like the Great North Museum in Newcastle, in the British Museum and in Kew Gardens, but in comparison with Layard, there's scant documentation. We know that he kept a day book or a journal, as he refers to it in his letters, but unfortunately, it doesn't survive. Consequently, I was very interested when Luke Turdinic, a descendant of Benjamin Green, who was a Newcastle architect, a railway architect, showed me 3 exercise books with copies of 60 letters sent by Loftus from the Middle East to friends and relatives in Newcastle-upon-Tyne. As some of you will know, it was customary in the Victorian period for letters to be circulated around families, and quite often some members of the families copied these letters out into notebooks, and that's what happened in this case. Then during the lockdown, I used the opportunity to transcribe the letters, and it's these letters which are now published in the book, which Paul showed you, together with some biographical information about Loftus. Now, as well as having sight of the letters, I'm also indebted to Frances Radford, who's with us this evening, for information about the Loftus family. She's a fellow resident of West Hampstead and was already a family friend before we discovered our joint interest in Loftus. She is, in fact, the great, I think, the great granddaughter of James Radford, Loftus's cousin, to whom many of the letters are addressed. And I was also privileged to meet last year Robert, or Bob Loftus, who lives in Maine in the US, who's the great-great-grandson of William Loftus, a direct descendant of Loftus's eldest son, seen here with his wife Karen on a visit to the British Museum. Well, after that rather long introduction, let's start. Layard, see if this works. Oh, yes. Loftus, sorry, was born in 1850 near, sorry, I'm getting this all wrong. He was born in 1820 near Maidstone in Kent. Here he is here. This is, does that show up on the, yes, it does. Born in Maidstone in Kent, where his father was on military service, but his roots were certainly in Newcastle, which accounts for his inclusion in the book entitled Men of Mark twixt Tyne and Tweed. And the family ran a coaching business in Newcastle, which had been founded by Loftus's grandfather up there. After attending school in Newcastle, Loftus went up to Cambridge, where he studied geology, but apparently he never finished his degree. But nevertheless, he attracted the attention while there of Sir Henry de la Beach, the head of the Geological Service. A single photograph survives of Loftus. This is in the Literary and Philosophical Society in Newcastle-upon-Tyne. And an engraving of a bust showing him with a fulsome beard after his return from the Middle East, was published in the book I've just referred to, Men of Mark twixt Tyne and Tweed, but the bust is thought to have been destroyed. Well, how did Layard get involved in Middle Eastern exploration? To answer this question, we've got to go back to the Treaty of Erzurum in 1847. There'd been a number of incidents on the long border separating Persia from the Ottoman Empire, which went from Lake Van in the north right down to Mahamara or Khorramshahr in the south. And because of these border incidents, a conference was established at Erzurum in 1847. And one of the recommendations of the conference was that a commission should be set up to determine the exact boundary. And the members of the commission were to be the involved parties, Turkey and Persia, and the two superpowers with interests in the region, Britain and Russia. Originally, Layard had been appointed as a member of this commission, but he withdrew at the last minute. So then the Foreign Secretary, Lord Palmerston, wrote to Sir Henry de la Beach asking him to recommend a geologist, and Sir Henry de la Beach recommended Loftus. It's extraordinary now to think that Lord Palmerston, who controlled British foreign policy for a large part of the 19th century, should have become so personally involved in this matter, but he certainly did, even to the extent of when Loftus had recommended the appointment, sending him a letter or having a letter sent to him along the lines of the Foreign Secretary doesn't want to inconvenience you, but suggests you take the next ship from Southampton. Well, when Layard set off, he was leaving behind a wife, Charlotte, with two small children and another on the way. But he wrote, "It certainly is a severe trial to be separated so long from my wife and children, but we both believe it to be for our good." Well, he was away for nearly 4 years on that in this first trip to the Middle East. He left Southampton in end of January 1849 and reached Constantinople after 19 days. And in Constantinople, Istanbul, he stayed at what was then regarded as the best hotel in the city, the Hotel d'Angleterre. He did some sightseeing in the city, but was shocked by the general squalor, a feature of life in the Middle East which he never got used to and refers frequently to in his letters. And his initial impression of the Turks was also rather jaundiced. Well, in Istanbul, he was well looked after by the British ambassador to the Porte, Sir Stratford Canning, and dined with him a number of times. And it was then that he met Layard for the first time. Their first encounter at this dinner party was not propitious, and Layard wrote rather disparagingly that he is not more than 26. In fact, he was 31 at the time, and just as unlike the author of a work on Nineveh as can be well conceived. Subsequently, Layard helped him in advising him about his forthcoming trip and what he should buy to prepare himself and so on. And he suggests that he should buy a gold band for his cap to give himself some air of authority. And interestingly, in this watercolor by F.C. Cooper of excavations at Nineveh, Layard is shown wearing a cap with just such a gold band. When he arrived in Constantinople, the other members of the Turco-Persian Frontier Commission had already left. And as it was now midwinter, Canning advised him to wait until spring before following them. But Loftus was impatient to get going, and there was also somebody else there in Constantinople who wanted to accompany him. He was called Dodson. And writing to Benjamin Green, Loftus says, "I don't know who he is, but we agree very well." Now, it's a strange thing, taking off into the unknown with somebody that when you don't even know who they are. But some research on my part has discovered that he was actually the son of a peer and was created Lord Mountbatten in 1884. But presumably at the time, he spoke in the right way and behaved in the right way, so no doubt that was okay. So then on 14th of March, they, from Constantinople here, they traveled by steamer to Samsun there, where they stayed with the British consul for a few days. And in early March, they left for Diyarbakir. Diyarbakir's down here, which was a journey taking 16 days. They started off accompanied by 2 servants, 2 local guides, and 9 horses, 3 of the horses for carrying baggage. Up to Sivas, which is there was heavy rain, and then between Sivas and Diyarbakir, they had to cross the Taurus Mountains, going, I think, here or at Kevany Madden over the Euphrates in a ferry. But either side of the Euphrates crossing, they had to go through mountain passes covered with snow. And the snow was right up to the backs of the horses, apparently, and they had a number of accidents with the baggage falling off and the horses stumbling over in the snow. And they also had to cross a snow-covered pass with gradients of up to 45%. So it must have been a horrific journey. And apart from the difficulties with the weather, Loftus describes the houses they stayed in during their journey, which he says were filthy and swarming with vermin. And the diet on the journey was very monotonous: coffee and biscuit at the start of the day, and chicken and rice in the evening. And at Khan, between Tokat and Sivas, they had what could have turned into a very nasty incident when Dodson got involved in a fight, with a physical fight actually, with a Turkish soldier, and it seems to have been over a squabble about who should be closest to the brazier in the place where they were staying. Well, after this journey, after this 16-day journey, they spent a day in Diyarbakir. Diyarbakir's here, where a raft was made for them to float down the Tigris to Mosul. And Loftus gives an interesting description of the vessel. He says it was made of 63 inflated animal skins supporting a wooden platform on which was erected a tent of black cloth, and it was steered by 2 Kurdish oarsmen. And this journey down the river from Diyarbakir to Mosul, so there we are there, took 6 days, throughout which there was very heavy rain. So they arrived in Mosul very wet, with all of their belongings sodden, and so on and so forth. Then in Mosul, they caught up with the other British members of the commission who were waiting for them there. And the head of the commission, whom he met for the first time, was Colonel William Kennett Williams, who later distinguished himself in the defense of Kars in the Crimean War. So he was in charge of the delegation. And also there was the surveyor, somebody called Lieutenant Glascott, the secretary and interpreter, Algernon Wood, who unfortunately died a year in the next year, 1850, somewhere near Susa, and a very talented man on the right here called Henry Churchill, interpreter. He spoke a number of languages. He'd actually been born in the Middle East. His father was in the British diplomatic service, and he was also an excellent artist, so a pretty good chap to have around. So when Loftus arrived there, these people were all camping on the top of Kuyunjik, one of the mounds of ancient Nineveh, and they were making excavations and drawings. While he was in Mosul, Loftus stayed with the British Vice-Consul Christian Rassam and his wife Matilda, and from their base in Mosul, they made a number of excursions accompanied by Christian Rassam. Apart from Kuyunjik, Nineveh, sorry, it's not on this map, I'll come to that in a moment. They visited Nimrud and Khorsabad. Khorsabad was the Assyrian capital, which had been excavated by the French consul Paul-Émile Botta, and Loftus recorded his views about this in a letter, very critically, saying there seems to have been no order or system in Layard's plan of operation, and he does not appear to have excavated low enough. I have an idea that the bulls will prove to be the ornaments of the top of the palace or of a terrace. Well, of course, that's completely wrong, and we can only surmise that at this point, before he'd done any archaeological work, Loftus was not familiar with the principles of stratigraphy. They also went at this time to Hatra, in the desert, about 80 miles to the west of Mosul, and their guide was Sotum, the Arab chief of the Shamar tribe, about who Loftus had written extensively. And about Sotum, Loftus wrote, "He's a fine fellow and is delighted with the English." The party had intended to undertake some excavations at Hatra, but shortage of drinking water meant they could only stay there a couple of days. They left Mosul at the end of April and reached Baghdad just over a week later. They traveled down the Tigris on 4 keleks or rafts, each made of 600 animal skins. And on reaching Baghdad, they rode straight up to the house of Major Henry Rawlinson, the resident of the East India Company. And although Loftus thought that Baghdad was a most wretched place, I'm quoting him, Loftus lived by comparison, Rawlinson, I'm sorry, I'm mixing up these names all the time. Rawlinson lived by contrast in grand style. He was attended by a guard of honor and had the personal use of a steamer moored alongside the residence. 15 servants in their native costumes waited at the table, and the guests wanted for nothing, including every kind of alcoholic drink. Then the birthday of Queen Victoria on 24th May 1849 was celebrated in grand style, with salvos of guns, all the most important residents of Baghdad coming to pay their respects to the Major, and everybody enjoying a sumptuous dinner. Well, Rawlinson made an instantly good impression on, for those of you who don't know, I expect nearly everybody does. Rawlinson, of course, has sometimes been credited with the decipherment of cuneiform. That may not exactly be true. He certainly had a role in that. So Loftus wrote, "The Major is a first-rate Eastern scholar and works hard the whole day long. He anticipates that the announcement of his cuneiform discoveries in London will create as much, if not more, excitement even than Layard's." He's talking here, of course, about Layard's discoveries at Nimrud and Nineveh, and by this time, Layard's book, Nineveh and Its Remains, had been published, and he was already a celebrity. But later, Loftus's relations with Rawlinson deteriorated when he worked under Rawlinson's supervision, first for the British Museum and then for the Assyrian Excavation Fund. Well, they now had to wait in Baghdad for the arrival of the other boundary commissioners. The Russians were already there, but the Turkish commissioner, Dervish Pasha, was still at Mosul, and the Persian commissioner, Mirza Jafar Khan, had gone on pilgrimage to Karbala. When they did turn up, summer had set in with a vengeance, with temperatures of up to 47 degrees centigrade in the shade and 58 degrees centigrade in the sun. And it was too hot to proceed to Mahamara down on the Gulf, that's Khorramshahr, where the work of the commission was due to start. And it was also too hot to cross the desert to get to the mountains. Well, to escape the heat of Baghdad, because there was also cholera in the city, the party moved to the village of Jarara, about 4 miles southeast of Baghdad. And here they lived in a house built of bricks that Loftus said has been removed from the great Sasanian arch at Ctesiphon by Colonel Taylor, Rawlinson's predecessor as East India Company resident. And interesting this, he also refers to a former Pasha of Baghdad having pulled down part of the monument to procure bricks for building Baghdad. Well, there were periods when the delegation had little to do, and in those quiet times, hunting was a popular recreation. Shooting francolins, these are the common game birds in Iraq, Mesopotamia. Shooting francolins and spear hunting boars were the preferred activities. And then on one occasion, they went in search of a hyena, which had been reported in the locality. And Loftus's horse somehow contrived to get onto the ground above the hyena's den, which gave way, and the horse with Loftus on it fell down into the hyena's den. But fortunately, the hyena wasn't at home at that moment, and Loftus's horse was able to scramble out of the den. Where they continued the search for the hyena, they eventually located it, cornered it, captured it, trussed it up and with ropes and put it onto the back of a horse. And then on the way back to the camp, the hyena cut through the ropes, escaped, so they all rushed off in pursuit of it again. And this all came to an end when a member of the Russian delegation shot the hyena dead with a rifle, which was considered to be very bad form. So there was also the opportunity to visit other places of interest, and they visited at this time Ctesiphon. They went to Uruk, and incidentally, Loftus, in one of his letters, got an interesting description of Uruk, quite a detailed description, and it's not something which appears in his book. Actually, much of this, what I'm telling you, is not to be found in his book. They also went to Bir's Nimrud down here, and also to, of course, to Babylon here. And at Babylon, he and Churchill re-excavated the famous Lion of Babylon. I think it must have been partly buried at this time because they hired workmen to actually dig it out. And according to Loftus, there was some controversy about at the time about whether it was a lion, as claimed by Claudius James Rich, or whether it was an elephant without a trunk, which the officers of the Euphrates Steam Navigation Company had claimed. So, as you see, of course, it is indeed a lion over a prostrate figure, probably of the 8th century BC. This is how it appears nowadays. It was actually sketched by Churchill, but it seems that his sketch doesn't survive. Well, the British party finally left Baghdad for Mahamara, for Kermanshah, which is no, sorry, it's not on this map. Towards the end of December 1849. So this is nearly a year after Loftus had set out. And in that year, practically nothing much had happened. But on this journey, while the main party went from Baghdad, down to Basra by steamer, Loftus was given permission sorry, no, they didn't go down the Tigris. They went down the Euphrates, down there, I think, probably. But Loftus was given, and Churchill were given permission by Colonel Williams to go down the east side of the Euphrates, down here, into the land of Chaldea, which was pretty much unknown territory at that time. And during this visit on the east side of the Euphrates, they went to Tel Hammam here, Tel Ede down there, and lastly to Warka. Well, at Tel Hammam, they collected fragments of a stone statue of the Sumerian ruler Gudea in the 3rd millennium BC, and at Mugher, which is Ur of the Chaldees on the right-hand side there. The Sumerian city, which was later made famous through the excavations of Leonard Woolley. Here they collected inscriptions for Rawlinson and miscellaneous antiquities. And there had actually at this time already been one season of excavation at Ur by the ex-consul's son, J.G. Taylor. And he reports that they could see Eridu, Abu Shahrain, in the distance, but they weren't able to visit the site. Well, at Warka, they stayed several days making a plan of the ruins, and then they moved on to Mahamara to meet the rest of the delegation. But Loftus was given permission by Williams to return to Warka to do excavations there. And Williams actually undertook to finance the excavations himself if the British government wasn't willing to do so. And he worked at Warka, or Uruk, or biblical Erech, for about 3 weeks in February 1850. And because of the high water level in the Euphrates, he camped about 9 miles away from the site. And he says in a letter that each day he rose at daybreak, worked all day at the site, rode back to the camp, often in the dark, and usually didn't get to bed before 2 a.m. for a few hours sleep. So that was his regime for 3 weeks. Well, Warka is known to have been a great urban site as early as the 4th millennium BC. And this watercolor here shows the facade of a temple building of early date. But mostly Loftus's efforts were directed at the Parthian period. And in the period when he was there, his workmen dug up about 100 of these glazed slipper coffins. Unfortunately, most of them, he was trying to procure perfect specimens to send back to the British Museum. And before he could get 3 complete specimens, he had to dig up round about 100, which is quite reprehensible. They're called slipper coffins for obvious reasons. They're in the shape of a slipper, and each one has got a hole in the end. And the idea is that a rope is tied around the ankles of the corpse. It's put through this hole, and then the corpse is pulled into the coffin. And these coffins date from about the first, mostly from the 1st to the 2nd century AD, that period. And the bodies are very often accompanied with jewelry and trinkets and other small things, such as this little bronze statuette that you can see here in that slide. Then, amongst other things, found in and around the coffins these terracotta figurines of figures reclining at a banquet, figures wearing trouser suits, are very typical of the Parthian period, 1st, 2nd century AD. Other terracottas are more familiar from the late Hellenistic period. These figures showing naked women. Then there's a lot of Parthian pottery. This green glazed pottery that you see here is also very typical of the Parthian period and probably comes from tombs alongside the coffins. But some of the other things he found at Warka are of earlier date. This, for example, here is a piece of Tridacna shell, which with engraving on it, which probably dates from the 8th or 7th century BC. Then after he'd finished at Warka, he went to Sinkara, which I think, oh no, sorry, not on that map. He went to Sinkara, otherwise known as Lhasa, which is an old Babylonian site, about 1750 BC. And there he found burials with terracotta figures and pottery. Then all this material was taken to Basra, where it was sketched by Churchill. It seems that Churchill wasn't actually with him during the 3 weeks that he was in Warka, but they anyway met up again in Basra. I should say at this point that it's very unclear from the letters how many people were actually with Loftus at any one time. And I think that's also the case with other 19th century explorers. For example, when I told you that Loftus and Churchill had been given permission to travel down the east side of the river Euphrates, one gets the idea that there were just the two of them on horseback. But when they get to Ur, it's suddenly revealed that actually there was a party of Turkish horsemen with them, even as many as 30 accompanying them on this trip. And that becomes clear because there was an incident at Ur when the locals took fright at seeing this party of Turkish horsemen, thinking that the Pasha was arriving to collect money from them, and they all ran up to the top of the ziggurat. But I'm just telling you this story to illustrate the fact that very often these people are not alone. Well, after that, Loftus was given permission to go to Susa, which is well, let me see, Disful, Susa, just there. But there, they went there because Colonel Williams was keen to do some excavations at Susa, thinking that the site might be as rich as Nimrud and Nineveh. But at Susa at this time, they met with a lot of hostility from the locals, from the Sayyids and Arab sheikhs, as Loftus says, and they were prevented from excavating. So all they could do was make a careful plan of the ruins. But while he was at Susa, Loftus had a serious accident. While riding out with Churchill, they came across a herd of wild boars and couldn't resist chasing them. Loftus's horse stumbled, did a somersault, and landed on top of him, injuring his right side and apparently causing internal injuries that troubled him for the rest of his life. Loftus describes the horse in a letter as a clumsy brute. Well, Colonel Williams then decided that to escape from the murderous heat of Mahamara, the British party should spend the summer in the mountains to the east of Disful. That is the mountains here. And there was now a further delay with the work of the commission, as there was a dispute about the ownership of Mahamara. By the Treaty of Erzurum, it was supposed to be treated to Persia, but the Turks refused to agree to this. So while they were waiting, Colonel Williams decided that the British group should go on a lengthy excursion, and from Disful, yes, that's right. They went via Khorramabad across the Zagros Mountains to Kermanshah. They visited the Sasanian grotto at Takhar-Bustan. They went to the great trilingual inscription of Darius, which is at Bisatun. Then they went to Hamadan, from Hamadan to Isfahan. And in Isfahan, those of you who know Isfahan will not be surprised to hear that Loftus was very impressed by the architecture, and the party was actually able to stay in one of the rooms in the monument known as Chel Satun. Then from Isfahan, they went down to Shiraz, visited Persepolis and Pasargadae. And en route, they had left some record of their presence in two places. This is at Takhar-Bustan. It's not a very good photograph, I think, but I hope you can see that they've engraved their names at the back of the grotto near the great horse of Khosrow's, between his legs, actually. And you can just see there Colonel Williams, R.A., 1850, under that Ulquin, and he was the surgeon accompanying the party, and under that W.K. Loftus along there. They also left their names at two different places at Persepolis. Well, then after spending Christmas 1850 in pouring rain in the desert in Ram Hormuz, the whole of the English team went for a month to Susa in 1859, doing some initial excavations. Then the whole party went back to Mahamara, and Loftus was still in pain from his fall at Susa. He went back to Baghdad to seek medical opinions. Dr. Hislop at the British Embassy told him that he must have received a severe crush on a portion of the bowels near the liver, but the liver itself does not appear to be injured. And he also consulted Dr. Balindale, the doctor on the Nitocris, that's one of the steamers on the Euphrates Tigris, who thought the liver had received a severe strain. Then the summer of 1851 was spent in mountains at the time of at the town of Keren to the west of Kermanshah. And the last letter in the collection that I'm talking about was actually written from there. But while at Keren, Loftus received a letter from Rawlinson asking whether, as Layard was leaving the country, he would be willing to continue excavations on behalf of the British Museum. And he replied that he assumed that Layard was not returning, in which case he would be happy to undertake the task. But if it is required of me merely to act in Layard's absence, I should, of course, decline altogether having anything to do with it. Well, anyway, he was given leave of absence from the Boundary Commission, and then under Rawlinson's nominal supervision, he worked at Susa for 2 months with Churchill and made some very interesting discoveries there. This is, he worked in all three of the great mounds at Susa, and these are the columns in the great palace of Darius. And Churchill made very nice copies of the double bull protomes, which grace the tops of the columns. He also copied the column drums. This one here has got actually an inverted Greek inscription added rather later. And these are some of the things that they found at Susa, including these fragments of alabaster with trilingual or inscriptions, or even inscriptions written in 4 languages. one of the interesting things he discovered was a cache of figurines of this type here. He actually found altogether 200 of them. Either this was the manufacturer's stock of the figurines, or perhaps he'd chanced upon a shrine which they'd been presented to. We just don't know. Loftus hasn't really been given the full credit, I think, that he deserves for his work at Susa. What I'm showing you now is some copies of inscriptions which he made, and these are included in a volume which is now in the British Library. It's not actually a publication, but it's a volume which is called Lithographic Facsimiles of Inscriptions in the Cuneiform Character from the Ruins of Susa. And the inscriptions are either in Old Persian or in Elamite. And there's actually 30 pages of these copies in this book. As far as I know, it's the only copy in existence. And when I was at the British Museum, quite often people asked how they could get access to this book. But I think some of these copies have never been published, so probably this whole volume deserves to be made available to scholars. Well, it's clear from letters that Loftus himself believed his greatest contribution to have been at Warka, but I think he failed to appreciate the significance of his work at Susa, maybe because of rude remarks that Rawlinson made about it. He said he wrote to Layard in 1852 that Loftus had turned the mound of Susa topsy-turvy without finding much, which was a dismissive comment and very far from the truth. Well, Loftus then rejoined the commission, which had actually nearly finished its work by now, and he returned to London in December 1852, having been away, as I said, for nearly 4 years. And he was now a free agent. So when the when the Assyrian Excavation Fund was established in London in the summer 1853, he was an obvious person to be appointed as its excavator. So he left again in October 1853, this time accompanied by the artist William Boucher, who worked with him at Warka and also at sites in Assyria. This is one of the beautiful watercolors produced by Boucher of glass vessels, either in or with some of the glazed coffins at Warka. Well, some scholars have been critical of Loftus's work at Warka, but Julius Jordan, who conducted German excavations there, 1912 onwards, wrote that the observations gathered by Loftus are of such versatility and so brilliantly presented that we felt solid ground under our feet from the very beginning of our work. Well, meanwhile, things in Mosul had not gone according to plan. Hormuz Rassam had been working there on behalf of the British Museum, but when the British Museum funds ran out, he had to stop working. So Loftus and Boucher moved up to Assyria and worked there from October 1854 till March 1855. At Nimrud, the initial results were rather disappointing, but these are sort of miscellaneous antiquities found and sketched by William Boucher. But what they did find at Nimrud was a chamber full of 8th century ivories. This was in the so-called Southeast Palace or Burnt Palace, ivories which are usually said to be of Syrian origin and dating from the 8th century BC. At Nineveh, Boucher was engaged in making copies of sculptures that had been excavated by Layard and by Hormuz Rassam. But it's often, although Loftus and Boucher did certainly excavate some new sculptures, it's sometimes difficult to know which ones they'd found and which have been found by Rassam, but it's certainly the case that this series here, showing a lion hunt, which had fallen from into room S in the North Palace from an upper story, certainly found by Loftus, as was this smaller sculpture known as the Dying Lion. Well, he was back in London by July 1855, having been away nearly 2 years. And it seems he spent the next 18 months writing his book, Travels in Chaldea and Susiana. But for reasons that are now unclear, it doesn't include any information apart from passing references to his excavations in Assyria. If he had included a report in the book, or had indeed written another book with some of Boucher's drawings, his reputation as a pioneering archaeologist of the Victorian era would certainly have been assured. Well, then he left England again, now as it was to transpire for the last time, in December 1856. He had taken an appointment as an assistant with the Geological Survey of India, but in the next 18 months, when in India, he achieved little, partly because the Indian Mutiny broke out in May 1857, and partly because Loftus himself obviously was not in good health. So in November 1858, he was given sick leave, and he died at sea on 27th November 1858, the day after embarking for England. And the cause of death is said to have been an abscess of the liver. One suspects that a contributory, or perhaps the primary cause of this, was his riding accident at Susa some 8 years previously. Well, sadly, Loftus left behind a widow and 5 young children ranging from 2 years to 13 years in age. And his widow Charlotte, here, died just 4 years later. It's just in conclusion now, it's tempting for those who are mainly interested in archaeology to think of Layard as primarily an archaeologist. He's much more than this. He'd been hired as a geologist. And although the opportunities for geological work in the alluvial plain of Mesopotamia was limited, he was continually making geological observations and wrote a number of substantial articles on the subject. He was also a naturalist and an enthusiastic member of the Natural History Society of Newcastle-upon-Tyne. He corresponded regularly with the distinguished naturalist Albany Hancock, and refers to making collections of shells, scorpions, snakes, and insects. He talks about stuffing birds himself, and his collecting activities earned him the nickname Father of Insects from the Arab chief Saturn that I referred to earlier. He also collected plants and seeds and was in constant correspondence with Kew Gardens. And it's really remarkable in view of all this that he should have found any time at all to do archaeological work. Well, with his archaeological work, it emerges from the letters that Loftus always saw himself as being in competition with Layard. He viewed Layard as a rival and is keen to compare his work with that of Layard. We've seen what he wrote about his first encounter with Layard in Constantinople, and a little later he writes with a hint of condescension, "You'll be surprised when I tell you that Layard cannot speak either Arabic or Persian and very little Turkish, though he certainly manages them well." Whether that's true or not, I don't know. After his discoveries at Warka, he was keen to compare them with those of Layard. I don't envy Layard his works at Mosul, as I can see that my discovery at Warka will create as much sensation as even his. And then, continuing in the same vein, if I have half the luck of my friend Layard, I shall afford more food for the wonder and astonishment of the antiquarian. He perceived excavation at Warka to be a greater challenge than digging in Assyria. Layard had even less difficulty to encounter than I may have. He was near a great centre of civilization, that is Mosul, while I was nearly 200 miles distant from the world, and so on. And then in various letters, he worries that Layard is intending to dig at Susa, and he also fears that Layard has aspirations at Warka and other sites in Babylonia. However, at the same time, he obviously had a capacity for friendship, and the French archaeologist Victor Place recorded that he had excellent relations with Loftus. And Colonel Williams wrote, "A better man, a more zealous and faithful public servant never lived." And according to a writer in a Newcastle newspaper, in Newcastle, he was greatly esteemed for his winning manner, kind and amiable disposition. Well, he's sometimes charged with being contemptuous of the local people. He was certainly fiercely patriotic to the extent of being chauvinistic, and some of his remarks smack of bigotry, jingoism, and xenophobia. These views were fueled by the fact that he didn't adjust well to life in the Middle East. He didn't like the food, and he makes frequent reference to the squalor of the housing. He was also shocked by what he saw as widespread bribery and corruption. But to be fair to him, these views were probably typical for the time. Lastly, it's clear Layard was very ambitious, very much intent on making a name for himself. He quickly realized that the fame and praise that he craved was more likely to be forthcoming through archaeological discoveries, and he was clearly jealous of the adulation that Layard was getting. And he had the misfortune to walk in the shadow of Layard, and certainly can't be regarded as his peer. Nevertheless, amongst 19th century archaeologists, he has a distinguished place. Above all, we should remember that his entire archaeological career spanned a period of less than 6 years. And for at least part of that time, he was engaged in other branches of research. To have excavated at 6 major sites, to have made so many discoveries, to have written one substantial book and a number of articles, and all before his early death at the age of 37, is a remarkable achievement. And perhaps we should leave the last word to Layard, who in a letter of condolence to James Radford wrote, "I had a high esteem for him, and believe with you that had he been spared, he would have distinguished himself even more than he has done. His memory will, however, be connected with a very interesting and important branch of Eastern research, in which he made many important discoveries and showed great judgment and skill." Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Wonderful. Opportunity for questions.
So I know you said it, but how did the letters originally come to you as detailed as this? I mean, did they just sort of hand them over to you, the family, or did you have to go up there and research it?
No, the letters are in these 3 notebooks. I
Yes.
showed you a picture
Yes, exactly.
of those. So that's what I transcribed.
But
They're copies. They're not the actual letters. They're
Okay.
copies of the letters in these notebooks.
And they were from Newcastle. You obtained them in
They
Newcastle?
were all, no, I didn't.
Okay.
The person who gave them, showed them to me, actually lives in London.
Okay, that's your friend.
Yeah,
Nick.
I
Okay.
didn't go to Newcastle to
Okay.
find
Well,
them.
why not?
Thank you. I'm left with a question about how his various trips were financed. It seems to me that when he had the feeling that he had a bit of time, he might go off and look at a site. But and traveling with companions, as you indicated, you mentioned 50 Turkish troops at one time. I wonder who paid them? Who paid him?
He, for the first part of his stay there, for the first 4 years, he was a member of this Turco-Persian Frontier Commission, which was financed by the Foreign Office by Lord Palmerston. And I think he personally had a salary of something like £80 a year, but obviously they had, you know, they had access to very substantial resources at the same time. And then after that, sorry, I'll talk into the microphone. After that, when he was employed by the Assyrian Excavation Fund, the funds for this body were raised by private subscription in the UK. And in the little bit in the middle, before he joined the Assyrian Excavation Fund, he was financed by the British Museum through Rawlinson. But I think throughout, you know, they had a lot of funds and resources at their disposal. Much, well, of course, one can't compare it with archaeologists in the 20th or 21st century, but I don't think they were ever very hard up. I mean, sometimes when you see the amount of funds that the people had for excavation, it corresponds like to more than £100,000 nowadays. So they were not badly off.
Thank you, John. You've done an amazing service in resurrecting Loftus, clearly great archaeologist, as you've shown us. Just one small observation is working at Nimrud this year and last year as part of the University of Pennsylvania expedition in the upper chambers, exactly one of the areas where Loftus did work at Nimrud and re-excavating his areas, among other things. It's clear that he was a good mud brick excavator, recorded the walls correctly and accurately, and recognized damage, erosional damage in the walls, and recorded the gaps exactly as we found them a century and a half later.
Well, that's very interesting. I think he has been underestimated as an archaeologist, certainly. I mean, probably because he didn't record his later work at all, basically, only just in these two reports of the Assyrian Excavation Fund, which are not a substitute for a proper report or a book about this work.
Well, but you said that he kept a day book. Now, if he did, maybe he did record these things, and you said his day book is gone. But how do we know it's gone? Is there any possibility that somewhere among the family or friends of the family, this day book may and other records might still be lurking?
Well, that's a very interesting question, Julian. I know that he wrote a journal or a day book because he talks about that at one stage. When he came back to the UK, he showed this day book to a representative of John Murray because he was thinking at that time to get the book published by John Murray. And apparently the John Murray's commissioning editor was very impressed by the day book. Why John Murray then didn't subsequently publish the book, I don't know, but he certainly refers to showing this man the day book or the journal. So maybe it does still exist. Perhaps it will turn up one day. Who knows?
Well, the Murray archive is in Edinburgh, isn't it? And they've certainly got some Layard stuff. I wonder if it's still sitting there unpublished.
Well, he could be, but I imagine he took it away again because the eventual publisher was not John Murray. It was a firm called Nisbet, wasn't it? So perhaps it would be worth investigating. Oh, there probably is correspondence with John Murray, I would think, definitely. So he must have been writing to him, asking him if he would publish the book. Yeah. Interesting point. Yeah.
Thank you so much for a very interesting lecture and all the information that you've given. Do you think that there's any record of his preparation for such a difficult journey? Because a lot of the documentation that we have today, it's further on, it's later. So how do you think he prepared for such journeys?
Well, as I said, he was offered the job of going with the Frontier Commission by Lord Palmerston. He had 2 weeks to get ready and to go. I suppose at that time. He didn't have much time, but then when he met with Layard in Constantinople, Layard, I think, told him what he would need while he was going around the Middle East, and he obviously did go shopping at that time and equip himself with things. And I suppose he did the same thing in Samsun as well, probably. So, you know, I mean, but I think these people traveled with a lot of things with them. You know, as I said, there was, did I say how many horses they had to carry the baggage? Quite a number. You know, they would have gone with various scientific instruments and or everything else that they thought they might need, I think.
Do you think that he prepared physically? Because Hamadan was used a lot for going up into any of the mountains, and people stayed there for about a month to prepare to climb. So do you think he prepared? Because it's a very, very difficult, I know because I live there, it's a very difficult environment.
Yes, well, it is. I think the horses probably bore the brunt of it, climbing over these passes, over the Taurus Mountains. But I expect he was pretty fit, I dare say, when he left. But I don't know. As I say, he only had 2 weeks to get ready, so not much time to go on a course.
Thank you very much.
Very good. In which case, I
Thank you. You said they had lots of horses in those mountains of Zagros and Taurus, where I originate from. They use mules for mountains regions rather than horses. Horses are more used for the plains and so on. So what is the justification for that?
Well, that's a very interesting point. He definitely refers to horses, but perhaps he couldn't distinguish between a horse and a mule. I don't know.
I'm sure they did. But what was the impression of the peoples they met today, apart from the archaeology? Any problems, any robbers? And, you know, those time it was Wild West, presumably, going through these territories.
Well, I suppose it was Wild West, yes, in a sense, for the foreign travelers, but for the people that actually lived there, not so much so. You know, I mean, they had their way of life, and they were a pretty civilized bunch, I think.
Very good. All right, thank you all very much indeed. I'm going to invite Dr. Rosalind Wade-Haddon, our Vice Chair, to give a vote of thanks.
John, thank you very much for this really clear account. I must confess that I've had a bit of dealings with the production of the book, and I think it's so pleased that it's ready now for sale to everyone at a nice discount as well. So please all sort of open your, I think you can even do it by credit card. I think Annie has the gizmo to do it. But that was a fascinating account, and I think, you know, it's all credit to William Loftus that he managed so much in such a short space of time. I mean, it is quite staggering what he did. And thank goodness we've still got lots of Churchill's wonderful drawings to record it all as well. But thank you so much because I know you worked very hard, you had a very productive lockdown, and we're the beneficiaries of this wonderful book. Thank you.